In the 16th and 17th centuries, many women were executed and tortured to death under the guise that they were in fact witches. Thousands of women were tortured and executed after being accused of being witches. In this time of great superstition and fear, people feared witches and what they might do to themselves and to their children. So, witches had to be identified. The problem with identifying witches is that they looked exactly like other human beings. Therefore, elaborate methods for detecting witches were invented so that those who were in fear of witches could identify them and protect themselves from the so-called evil power that witches possessed. Witches did not go about proclaiming that they were witches, and therefore they were impossible to detect. A system had to be developed so that they could be identified, and so that the population could be protected from the wrongdoings that witches may do to them. Many theories were put forward by many people in authority as a way of identifying witches. Some of these attributes that may identify an individual as a witch could be in the physical form, the way that they walk, the way that they dress, particular biological features of a woman that could identify them as a witch. However, other identification methods, including looking at the history of a woman's behavior as a way of identifying them as a person who was involved in witchcraft and therefore was in league with the devil. It was not until the reign of Henry VIII that official laws came into place regarding witches and witchcraft. There had, in fact, been trials of suspected witches for hundreds of years, but these were not carried out under the official laws of the country. Rather, they were carried out by the hysteria of particular communities. It was in the 16th century that these laws really became prominent, and in that, many trials began to take place. It is worth noting that at that time in society, everybody believed in God, but also everybody believed in the devil. They believed that the devil was at work throughout life, constantly trying to tempt people into his evil ways. It was under that society of paranoia that the frenzy against the concept of witches being present in society began to turn into a fever of paranoia. However, by the time of the 18th century, the belief that witches were real and that they were in fact doing evil deeds within society began to wane. As a result of this, the number of women being convicted as witches began to decrease. This means for nearly 200 years, there was in fact a frenzy against witches, as society believed they were real and that they had to take on extraordinary measures to protect themselves from the power of these evil doers. It was in 1735 that a new Witchcraft Act was passed, which stated that witches do not actually exist. The last trial in England to identify and condemn a witch was in 1727, 8 years before this act against the idea that witches existed was passed. It was under James I that witch trials became more prominent and rapidly increased in numbers. King James I became king in 1603. Even before he became king, he actively encouraged witch trials. So becoming king, he wasted no time at all and pressed forward his campaign against witches within society. The fact that the king had introduced a new act against witches stirred up fear within the communities of the United Kingdom and led credence to the idea that witches did in fact exist. Going back to this time, it was a time in which everybody, as well as believing in religion, also believed in the knowledge of their king. He was, after all, anointed by God. So if the king under which you are subject passes an act against witches, it was confirmation that witchcraft did in fact exist, and also existed to such an extent and to such a danger that an act was necessary to try and eradicate them from society. This massively increased the belief that witches existed within the peasantry of the country. This then led to more people being accused of being witches, as they believed they were serving the king by helping to eradicate these evil doers. Historians argue as to whether or not James I truly believed in witches, or whether or not he was trying to set himself up as the saviour of the people of Britain by proclaiming that witchcraft was present and was a very serious danger. He would stand up and save the people of Britain against this evil power. Many also suggest that James I was a sadist, and that he set up these witch trials because he enjoyed watching women being tortured. But this was also taking place across Europe. The difference between the European way of dealing with witches and the British way of dealing with witches was that across Europe they would be burned at the stake. However, in Britain they would be hung. Many people would also believe that the rope which was used to hang a witch had mystical powers, and as such many people would pay large amounts of money for a piece of rope that had hung a witch. Another method used to execute a witch was to drive a stake into the heart of the witch, and this was often done at the crossroads of a road network. The idea being that the witch's soul would not know in which direction to go once it was released from the witch's body, and therefore would not be able to return to the devil, who was said to be the master of all witches. It was rumored that the witches drew their power through the acts of abomination, using upside-down crosses, and also performing religious rituals backwards as a way of defying God and Christ, and in doing so they would conjure up and show their loyalty to the devil. In the 1650s in England was the highest proliferation of witch hunts and trials. This was known as the Purification Period, a period in which the authorities were the most active in hunting down and executing witches. During this period, it was decided by the authorities that in order to hunt down and remove witches from society, it could not be left just to the peasantry to accuse and bring witches to trial. Therefore, a new profession was invented, and so the profession of the witch hunter was born. These were people whose job it was to travel the country and find out about areas in which there was suspected witches and bring them to the courts to be tried. Matthew Hopkins was the most famous and well-known witch hunter throughout history in the United Kingdom. He was so revered for his craft that he got given the title of Witch Hunter General. Villages that were engulfed with a frenzy of paranoia about witches would pay him huge sums to come to town and help purify their village. On one single day in Chelmsford, he hung no less than 19 witches. He was a ruthless man who spared nobody that he confirmed as being a witch. His main technique for identifying a woman as a witch was to strip them naked and look for the devil's mark upon their body. He alone decided what was the mark of the devil. He alone would decide whether a blemish on a woman's body identified them as a witch. Sometimes as little as a spot or a mole, a birthmark or a rash would be enough to convince him that the woman that he was identifying as a witch was in fact in league with the devil. He would often prick the area around the blemish, and if the subject did not scream out in pain, he would say that that was proof they were in fact a witch, because only a witch would not feel pain upon being pricked with a needle or a knife. He claimed that it was the devil's work, that the devil was protecting them from the pain, and therefore they must be in league with the devil himself. It is said that he had a device with a retractable needle, so when he pricked an individual, it would appear that the needle was going into the skin of the woman who was being tested to be a witch, because the handle of the device would move down closer to their skin. It is said that the reason he did this was because the more women he would identify as witches, the more he would receive in payment from the particular village. because of the fear that people felt around this time. Witch hunters were very well paid, and as a consequence of that, many people would go into the profession in search of fortune, and in fact find as many women as possible guilty of being witches, so that word would get round that they were very good at identifying those who were in league with the devil. The peasantry of the time would talk and spread stories of witch hunters, and of course, they would want to find as many witches as possible so that they could make their community as safe as could be. Hearing that a man was extremely proficient at finding witches, that would be the man that they would hire, because they would feel that he would eradicate the witches from their town in the most thorough way. Unfortunately, it is true of human society that amidst any crisis, there are those who see an opportunity to make money. And in this time of witchcraft, there was certainly an opportunity for those who wanted to make themselves more wealthy to do so by proclaiming that they could save a town or village from evil forces. It seems crazy today that people would believe such a thing, but in those days, the belief in witches was so convincing that people really did live in fear as to what might happen to them and their children if they allowed witchcraft to go on within their community. But it was not just the chance to increase the size of a person's pocketbook that led them into being a witch hunter. By saving a village from a terrible fate, one could also elevate oneself to a position of great importance. This could be used for political reasons, but could also be used to help them attain other things, such as the hand in marriage of a woman who was, under normal circumstances in society, regarded as being at a higher level to themselves. They were, in fact, setting themselves up as heroic figures, and heroes were well respected within that time. However, as mentioned before about James I, there were many who went into witch hunting because they were, in fact, of a sadistic nature. People who liked to make other people suffer, and, in fact, liked to kill other people, could not do this without being convicted themselves. So, by setting themselves up as a witch hunter, they were given license to torture and kill, and then were revered by it and even paid for it. For the sadist, this was the ideal situation of opportunity. It is ironic that under this guise of trying to stop the evil of witchcraft, many evil people were given license to do almost all the evil they had ever dreamed of, because of the belief in witchcraft at that time. There would have been those who genuinely believed that they were doing God's work. However, there would have also been those who simply did not believe in witchcraft, but simply saw an opportunity. It was a situation which attracted the best of con men, men with charisma who could convince and scare other people into believing such things, could do so and walk away with privilege, position, power, and money. These conmen would identify particular towns and villages where a bad thing had happened fairly recently, a flood or a disastrous crop, and turn up to the village and convince the villagers it was because they had evildoers within their midst, informing them that they could guarantee that no such event would happen again to their town or village. They would convince them to pay them to eradicate the evil doers from their village. By modern standards, this seems insane. But in this period of extreme superstition, people were desperate for anybody to help them who had a good story to tell. And if this witch hunter sounded convincing and claimed he had saved other villages from a similar fate, in this time of deep superstition and also poverty, if a village was starving because its crop had failed, it would be desperate to make sure that such an event did not happen during the next harvest. Along comes the witch hunter, who claims he can guarantee that next year's harvest will not be sabotaged by the evildoers within their community, that he will seek them out and ensure the safety of the village. In such a situation and time in human history, many villages would come to the conclusion that they needed such a person's help, and so would pay such a person to save them from a disastrous fate. There was, in fact, no accountability in this, because once the trial had taken place and the confirmed witch had been executed, the witch hunter would move to another town or village far away. If it turned out that the next year's crop also failed, then the people of the village would have no way of finding the witch hunter. The witch hunters would simply move from town to town, village to village, always avoiding the town that they had already been in order to avoid any accusations against themselves that they had in fact not stopped the evil doing that was being done to that particular village. It is worth noting that during this time there was little communication across the country. So by traveling around and even using different names, a witch hunter could constantly reinvent himself and present himself to new villagers who were in a frenzy of witch paranoia. One other method for identifying a witch was to bind their hands and legs and throw them into a pond or river. If they floated to the surface, they were identified as being made of wood, and it was said that witches were made of wood. However, if they sank to the bottom and did not return, they were in fact innocent. After a certain length of time, a person who was suspected as being a witch would be pulled from the water. However, in many cases, that person would have already drowned. So, regardless as to whether or not a person was in fact identified as a witch, the fact that you were made to stand trial was often a death sentence in of itself. One of the problems with Britain being involved in witchcraft hunting was that when it was passed as law, it was also passed throughout the Empire of Britain. This meant that many countries around the world that would have, not under normal circumstances, executed people for being witches, in fact did so as they followed the law of their imperial masters. The last witch execution in the United Kingdom took place in 1682. One institution that really helped the frenzy of the witch hunt was the church. The church believes that all magic, unless carried out by Jesus or God, is sacrilegious. The problem with this is that anybody performing any kind of ritual or medicinal practice that was not within the practice of the church would be confined as being sacrilegious. Because the church had so much power throughout the country and, in fact, the world, if they labelled something sacrilegious, then it was taken as fact by the peasantry of the country. And in that, anything happening that was sacrilegious would be labelled as the work of a witch and would lead to a trial and possibly an execution. Many were executed during this time because they had done the good deed of healing another. And although many would be grateful and also would be impressed by such a thing, there would be those within society who would deem this as black magic, and therefore would go to the church and start telling tales that an evil sorcery had been done, that a person had perhaps been brought back from the dead. This would often lead to such a person being brought to trial and executed as a witch. Going back to the sadistic nature of many of the witch hunters, it was not just them who was practicing sadism when it came to the trials and execution of witches. There were those in society who would use the witch hunt in order to eradicate a rival. There are those who would see another as a threat, whether physically or whether financially, or even romantically, in terms of capturing the heart of another, and want this rival out of the way. One way to achieve this would be to accuse their rival of witchcraft. Of course, these days, accusing somebody of being a witch would not help you in eradicating them as a challenge. However, in this time of deep paranoia and superstition, it was a very good strategy to eliminate another person. Claiming that somebody was a witch, that you had seen them carry out some kind of sacrilegious act, and then going after and seeking a witch hunter to come to town, knowing that the witch hunter was just an opportunist and charged per execution, would be an almost foolproof way to get rid of a rival. Proclaiming to your village that your rival is a witch and therefore she should be executed would most of the time have little effect. However, bringing a witch hunter, a well-known and respected witch hunter, to town and having them give the verdict would convince the rest of the village to go along with it and allow this person's execution. With nobody in the village having any idea how to identify a witch. These gullible villagers, who would have been very uneducated at the time, would have most likely taken the word of this famous and respected witch hunter and agreed that the person must be executed in order to save wrongdoing from being done to the village. There are many who are jealous of others and feeling helpless that they will never be able to elevate themselves to the position of the person of which they are jealous. This was a route to ensure their ruination and possibly their death. At this time of great superstition, there were undoubtedly those who performed acts that were used to bring about good and negative results. People knew nothing of science, and so there were those who had theories that by doing certain things, concocting certain things, stirring certain things together, that they could somehow, in some mystical way, make something happen. This is, in effect, witchcraft. But the idea of the witch is that whenever they do this, it is to cause a negative effect. However, the difference between good and bad is a point of view. Of course, by bringing together a potion and stirring it in a cauldron and using that to kill another person, you are obviously using your witchcraft or your early science or medicine to bring about a negative and evil thing. An example of mysticism and witchcraft that would not necessarily be considered as evil to the vast majority of us would be stirring a potion to force a person to fall in love with you. Though this is manipulative, it sits on the fence between being evil and just being wishful. Such practices were used often during the medieval period, and although considered slightly strange by most, would not have labelled the person a witch. However, during this time of mass hysteria around witches, anybody seen carrying out such a practice would have been considered a witch, even though they were not trying to cause deliberate harm to another person. So there is clearly a grey line between witchcraft and carrying out practices that those around you may consider to be rather different or strange. Taking it a step further towards medicine, in this time of little medical knowledge, and a time in which the vast majority of people were very uneducated, one carrying out medicine could also be labelled a witch. The fact that the person is trying to save another person's life or trying to reduce their discomfort would often not be ruled as a positive thing, because the mass hysteria of the time would create a situation of paranoia where they felt this person had secret powers, and whether for good or bad, people would see that as a threat and label them a witch and want to see them eradicated from their society. It was, in effect, a very dangerous time to be doing homemade medicine, whether for good reasons or for bad. Another practice, which also could be labeled as witchcraft, would be that of science. Science is the practice of rationally deciding how the world is actually functioning. However, this rational explanation of how the world functions and was created went against the teachings of the church. And anything that went against the teachings of the church was labeled sacrilegious. And anything labeled as sacrilegious was labeled the work of the devil. It would have been very easy for anybody who was trying to figure out the way that the world worked to be labeled a witch. People had so much loyalty to the church, and any deviation from that was seen as an abomination. So, with this grey line as to what is witchcraft and what is science and what is medicine, we must ask the question, what is witchcraft? How do we classify it? Witchcraft is essentially a form of magic, and magic is a practice which claims to be able to create an effect by non-causal means. Non-causal means are something that can affect something without being directly connected to it. An example of a causal effect would be you have a sore throat, you visit the doctor gives you some throat medicine and your throat feels better. The reason your throat feels better is because what the doctor has given you has created a direct chemical effect on your throat which has soothed it. However, with magic, there is no actual direct causal effect. It is the idea that by concocting a potion or performing a particular dance or chant, that somehow through some kind of mysticism, an effect is caused somewhere else that is not directly in contact with the actual practice. The reason that magic is classified as a non-causal effect is because, unlike the throat medicine, which directly affects the throat and soothes it through a direct chemical attachment, magic will create the soothing through some mystical force that is almost impossible to explain and identify. In the 1600s, Europe went through a religious reformation. This meant that Europe was split between Protestant and Catholic beliefs. During this period, in which both churches competed with each other for the affections and beliefs of the people, there was in fact a competition to prove who was the most holy, and as such, witch hunts went through the roof, as both churches wanted to be seen as the institution that was ridding Europe of its evildoers. At the same time, during this hysteria, the kings and queens of Europe also wanted to prove their worth in terms of their power and their ability to govern well. And one of the ways to prove that you could govern well would be to have a great record of ridding Europe of evil sorcerers. It was, in effect, a competition between kings and queens. The more witches you executed, the greater a leader you seemed to be. One of the countries that was most badly affected by the paranoia around witchcraft was Scotland. Between the years 1590 and 1662, there were 5 intense waves of witch paranoia across Scotland, and the result of this was the execution of 2,500 witches. This was 5 times the average per person that was executed across Europe. Many historians attribute this high level of witch execution to King James VI, who was the King of Scotland at the time, who later became King James I of England. The reason that King James VI was so obsessed with witches was because while he was making a ship journey back to Scotland in 1590, a massive storm erupted which shook his ship and nearly killed him and his bride. As a result of this, he was left with a deep paranoia about witchcraft, and this altered his state of mind to a complete and utter obsession. This paranoia was also fueled by the fact that the Danish also believed that the storm had been conjured by witches. This was all the confirmation that King James VI needed to completely convince himself that witches were real, and they were actively and prolifically practicing their dark magic across Europe. King James accused his throne rival, the Earl of Bothwell, Francis Stuart, of meeting with witches in Berwick and asking them to bring up a storm to destroy his ship. Fortunately for King James, at this point in time, torture was legally acceptable in witch trials, though in England and Wales it was in fact outlawed at this time. King James used this as a way to proclaim how important he was as a king. The fact that the devil and his minions were actively trying to take him from the throne enforced the idea that he was the king of righteousness and he was the man to save his people. So perhaps it was fueled not only by paranoia, but also by megalomania. This idea that he alone was the one to take on the devil and save the Scottish people. In fact, King James was so obsessed that he wrote a book, and in it he explains how the devil operates on earth. He claimed that the devil is the leader of fallen angels, which make pacts with humans, granting them powers to wreak havoc on earth. In his book, he claims the only way to fight against this evil is to appeal to God by respecting the God-given powers that God has given to kings. And in doing so, he is telling others that the only way to save themselves from evil is to follow him blindly, because God has given him all the powers that he needs to defeat evil. He is essentially claiming to be the chosen one, and in doing so, is claiming that he is something like Christ himself. Some in religion would claim that this in of itself is sacrilegious. However, King James obviously believed in himself so much that he could make such a claim, and because God had chosen him as king, that would in of itself not in fact be sacrilegious. So why were the majority of people who were executed as being witches female? During the 16th century, all of the scholars who wrote about witchcraft were men and were also religious. These men were completely and utterly misogynistic, and therefore claimed that women as the weaker sex were more susceptible to being converted by the devil, and therefore more likely to be witches. In fact, during this time, only around 20% of those accused of being a witch were in fact male. But it was not just King James VI who used witchcraft to elevate himself. It was also the church. The church claimed, and still does to some extent, that it is the guardian of good and bad, and that it has authority to decide what is evil and what is pure. In this time of paranoia, it was an opportunity for the church to raise its position in importance by claiming it had the knowledge and purity to be able to seek out all evil, and in that it had license to hold its own courts and also hand people over for execution. By claiming that the world is fragile because there are evil doers out there, and that they are actively combating this evil, it elevates them to a position of not just spiritual guidance, but also a position of saving mankind from evil. Witchcraft has always been around, going right back to tribal times. However, it was the period between the 16th and 17th centuries where witchcraft was labeled as being evil. Even today, we have a thought process that instantly thinks of witches as being evil wrongdoers. However, because the church was so adamant that witchcraft should not take place, due to the fact that it was a competing religion against Christianity, we now still have this thought process in our mind of assuming that a witch is an evil wrongdoer. So, in effect, the branding of witchcraft, even as we see it today as being something evil, is in fact an invention of Christianity, which was, after all, simply a competing religion. It is for this reason that witch hunting was most prominent across Western Europe, because Western Europe was completely and utterly Christian, and therefore witchcraft was universally condemned across the continent. During a witch trial, in which the accused witch would be tortured, they would also be forced to name accomplices. Under such pain, many accused witches would draw names out of a hat just to try and ease the pain that their torturer was placing upon them. As we now know, interrogation through torture rarely provides reliable information, And this was obviously also the case in the 16th and 17th centuries. So a person in your village could be accused of being a witch, and within 24 hours you could find yourself also being arrested and tortured to confess your pact with the devil, and also at the same time being forced to name accomplices yourself. Before you knew it, one accusation against one individual could lead to as many as 20 people being executed for witchcraft. One of the methods to get an accused witch to confess and tell of the elaborate doings of witches was sleep deprivation. The trials would often keep a witch awake for many, many days, which would lead the individual prone to hallucination and complete confusion of the mind. During this time of sleep deprivation, the accused witch would sometimes confess to all kinds of strange and fantastical rituals, which were simply brought on by the fact that their mind was no longer functioning properly due to lack of sleep. Lots of these rituals would then be reported on and spread across the country as if they were facts of what witches get up to. This, in turn, would also fuel the paranoia around witches, as people heard about these dark practices that witches apparently actually undertook. Under intense pain and with sleep deprivation, and the pressure to please your interrogator so that they do not inflict any more pain on you, the mind would search for anything that the interrogator would ask them, and they would feel a pressure to push the story towards the fantastical, knowing that the interrogator would find that satisfying, as it moved them and their apparent practices closer towards the bizarre, and therefore closer towards what was perceived to be the strangeness of witchcraft. There is no doubt that witches have been treated very badly throughout history, and particularly in the 16th and 17th century. Yet nowadays, people do not believe in superstition as much as they used to in those early times. As a result of this, nobody fears witches in the Western world. However, there are parts of Africa where they do still believe in the evil of witchcraft. But despite all of this terrible treatment, the executions and the tortures, witchcraft has survived and is now flourishing. It is, in fact, the fastest growing religion in the world, because now it is safe to practice witchcraft.